in 1979, my dear friend and colleague, longtime colleague, John Kabat-Zinn, essentially developed what became known as mindfulness-based stress reduction, with the intention of bringing mindfulness practice into mainstream medical care. In those days, there were lots of people falling through the proverbial cracks in the healthcare system. We created a very large net, if you will, to catch people who in a lot of ways weren't being served well by medicine, or medicine just didn't really quite know what to do for them. And in the early days of our work, a lot of those people were people suffering with chronic pain. And as well as a whole cadre of people or cohort of people who had a whole range of stress-related signs and conditions that really needed in something more than purely a prescription or surgery. And from the beginning, MBSR wasn't at all antagonistic to mainstream and modern high-tech medicine. We saw it as a complement. We still see it that way. More than 6,000 physicians and hundreds of other healthcare providers have referred nearly 23,000 people who have completed our MBSR program at UMass. And of course, there are sites all over the world now, more than 740. So they give access to tens of thousands of people to MBSR. And so really it was, in our view, and still is, if you allow modern medicine to do what it can for you and to you, and at the same time, you learn to do something for yourself. You learn to take care of yourself in new ways. Then you might create a synergy between what can be done to and for you. And of course, we all need things done to and for us at times. We all need help from medicine and its interventional power and capacity and its high-tech capabilities. And at the same time, we are a treasury within ourselves. We have a certain kind of nobility and capability and luminosity that can be brought to the fore, and creating a kind of synergy that I often say is like catching lightning in a bottle. And that relies on people becoming highly participatory in their health and well-being, and not only on the level of what we usually think of as the biology, but the psychology and the heart as well, if you will. And it tends to captivate people and compel people over time if you're able to create an environment for them where they could actually begin to study me. Who am I? What am I? How is it that my habits, my behavior, my conditioning, somehow or other, of course, we're all conditioned in some way, in many ways, contributes to my distress, and how might the training of the mind and the body and the heart actually begin to dissolve that distress in some ways and actually set the stage for what I like to think of as flourishing. And that takes absolute participation on the part of a person. You can't simply listen to it. It can't be a purely cognitive process, but it relies on a deep experiential as well as a kind of reflective training and education. First of all, I reject the term secular. I understand why people who are in a particular religious tradition would use the word secular as a way of discerning between what is generally considered religious and religious tradition and what is not. I've never thought of MBSR secular. I think of MBSR as sacred. And I think that people have a deep yearning, a deep longing for the sacred in their everyday lives. And you might say that traditional religious structures and even meditative schools, and those that have somehow come out of those traditions or informed those traditions, offered people a touch and a taste and maybe a deep drink of the sacred. But there are millions, maybe billions of human beings that are not necessarily connected to those traditions, or are also looking for a taste of the sacred in their everyday experience, that wouldn't normally go to a Buddhist meditation center or a Christian meditation center. And so MBSR has really taken the position that, without really ever saying it this way, at least I'm taking this position, and I know a lot of my colleagues share it too, many of who are classical Buddhist meditation teachers or Christian contemplatives, that the world is thirsting for the sacred. And why not make it straightforward, commonsensical, non-dogmatic, so that people can actually, they don't have to have a belief system. They don't have to enter the process with a dogma, but rather with an open mind, with a certain kind of inquisitiveness and curiosity about, well, what might I discover about myself? What might I discover about myself and the resources that I am that might actually change my relationship with parts of my life that I either reject or fragment off or disavow or turn away from. And in that way, remember, and I mean that in the deepest sense of remembering, not so much as where did I leave my keys this morning, but I mean remembering in the sense of remembering that which we actually already are, and that is obscured. And I think that MBSR is beginning to fulfill that role in the culture. And my own sense is that we don't know where a new, if you will, American or Western Dharma tradition, and I don't mean Buddhist Dharma, I mean universal Dharmic tradition, is going to go. We're at the front end of something that seems to me incredibly interesting and exciting, and, well, maybe not exciting, but interesting and compelling in some way, because it has the potential to touch the lives of people in ways that I think the society is longing to be touched. Nobody actually knows fully yet the mechanisms of action. There are certainly theories about it. There are hypotheses about it, and they span various dimensions of the human experience. By example, certainly in the realm of neuroscience, there is a theoretical view of how mindfulness meditation might work on a neural level. From the point of view of psychology, there is reference to how it might work in regards to the human psyche. But curiously, I don't think that mindfulness meditation works. I think that we work. And in some ways, I think the meditation, if you will, this may sound strange to the listeners, does us after a period of time of sort of launching and getting ourselves, if you will, engaged in some way. Certainly, some of those mechanisms, at least the theoretical or possible mechanisms, have to do with attention, the capacity to regulate attention. Others have to do with the capacity to regulate emotion, that have to do with, if you will, what's often called in the psychological literature exposure, where you actually approach what you would typically avoid, and you learn something about your capacity to meet those situations, not by being forced to approach those situations, but because they are inevitably coming up in our everyday lives. And if we have some methodology or some method to actually, or means of meeting them, which is how the meditation practice can unfold in a person's life, it becomes practical and useful to learn how to pay attention, how to be present, how to notice the way the mind moves away into past or future experience, and how many of our resources that we need to meet the challenges and demands of everyday life arise out of our capacity for presence, for being present here and now, in the face of that moving off, how we're in some way conditioned to appraise for the threat in our lives, and rightly so. We're in many ways the product of people across thousands of generations who learned to do that really well. But it often also blinds us to what are our deeper possibilities, what are our deeper capabilities. And so certainly attention comes to play here, our capacity to turn toward rather than away from. When you think about the biology of stress, we're wired to fight or run, flee, or freeze in various threatening situations. They are extraordinarily valuable capabilities that we have relied on for millions of years to survive. We also have this capacity to turn toward, to meet situations, to do the very opposite of what we are hardwired to do, which is usually not what's called for in our lives. So what is it in us that is actually capable of meeting something, to in some ways begin to engage in a kind of scientific investigation, if you will, using the same principles of science or scientific research or investigation, to actually begin to examine our own experience, and then importantly, reflect upon it, and to actually take up the discipline of meditation and actually learn through experience. MBSR is often, we've called it for years actually, for nearly the whole 37 years of our existence, a clinic in the form of a course. That's pretty unusual, but these are not, the competencies and capabilities that people are learning about in the context of MBSR can't be taught in a single session. Well, I suppose they could, but people generally need more support than that. And they need repetition. And of course, we know as well from from neuroscience and from neuroplasticity that the way the brain actually changes and adapts and becomes, if you will, more and more itself is through repetition. It's through a kind of familiarity. We also know that it's easy to become conditioned through familiarity. And so in some ways we're countering that one kind of familiarity for, if you will, recognizing, wow, there's parts of my repertoire, my human instrument, that I haven't fully examined. I haven't played that music. And in MBSR, people are in fact learning in a systematic way to discover more about who and what they are. And one of those capabilities that certainly relies on attention and our capacity to focus, that relies on our capacity to learn to deliberately stop, because you've probably noticed that momentum is intoxicating. and it's highly conditioned. And so our capacity to stop, which people learn about in MBSR, or to pause, if you will, is included in this process as well. And so as people begin to become more accustomed to, if you will, being in their bodies, as people get more accustomed to knowing what's actually happening in the body, as people become more accustomed to recognizing what is the relationship to what's happening in what we typically call the mind, meaning my thoughts and emotions, and how they affect the body, and in turn, how what's happening in the body resonates in the mind, and they begin to study it and examine it in more detail, they begin to, through that, what I'm calling stopping, that examination is a kind of stopping, it leads to a kind of seeing. And that seeing leads to a certain kind of understanding of the situation. And that understanding leads to the possibility of making new choices, hopefully wiser choices about how I will be, how I will respond, rather than react in the face of this familiar situation or unfamiliar situation. Because we're, if you will, people are learning to become more conscious, more awake, more aware. And as that occurs, people begin to learn to turn toward rather than away from, because they begin to recognize that the entirety of our lives is, if you will, the curriculum. And everything that arises in our lives is an opportunity to learn. And if you will, engage in a kind of self-re-education that might ultimately be liberating, freeing, because we're actually beginning to tap into larger aspects of who we think we actually are. And that itself is a kind of, if you will, sounds scary, but a kind of dissolution of the self we think we are. And that's a central piece of MBSR. Not that it comes around in forms of lectures, but it comes through practicing and through discovery, through inquiry, through reflection. You know, by example, I had a number of participants in a research study say, you know, I feel more like a verb than a noun at the end of the course. Well, that's a really interesting way of putting it, isn't it? Because we like nouns and they have tremendous value in our lives and in our language and communications, and they're fixed. When somebody says Boulder, Colorado, we know it. When somebody says Saki or Tammy, well, the noun is known in some ways. It's also fixed and frozen in time in some way. And what they were pointing to is movement. I'm more like a verb and less like a noun. So it's a little harder to nail down the verb. And it's a little bit more nimble, agile, more possibilities, because it's pointing at action. And so the meditation that I'll move us towards now is around this capacity to turn towards and meet situations. And this capacity to turn toward is built into mindfulness practice from the very beginning. It isn't like it's, in quotes, an advanced part of the practice, just the way love and compassion and warmth or friendliness towards self is built into the practice from the beginning in MBSR. In fact, you could say in a very real way, and I certainly said it in Heal Thyself, mindfulness is an act of love. Our capacity to hold ourselves uh, with less judgment, with less aggression, with a capacity to kind of be hospitable to whatever arises in our lives, is something we virtually all need. We haven't been taught this. So let's practice a little. So whether you're sitting in a chair on the floor, seeing what it's like to simply sit up and feel the sense of uprightness through the head and the neck and the back. And you might want to uncross your legs so your feet are firmly on the floor if you're in a chair, and you can feel that sense of stability or steadiness that is in some way reflected in the body position and posture. And find a comfortable place to rest your hands on your hands or on your knees or your thighs, or you can fold them together. And if you like, you can leave your eyes open, or you can close your eyes. And I think I'm going to close my eyes, so just so you know this. But I'll be here with you. I'm not going anywhere, even though my eyes are closed. And let's begin by simply becoming attentive to the actuality of sitting. If you're sitting, if you're standing, then the actuality of standing. I'm going to assume most people are sitting, so I'm going to use those words. So sitting here, you might notice the feeling of pressure where the buttocks meets the chair. Or the feeling of coolness against the face, or warmth. Or the feeling of the hands on the legs or the fingers entwined. The sense of weight or lightness. The sense of the feet and the floor meeting. So on a cognitive level, of course, we know we're sitting. But I'm asking for you to become aware, awake to what it means to sit by feeling the body sitting here now. And we all have that capacity for what's called interoception, this capacity to feel the body from the inside. And for really no other reason than because those bodily sensations are available to us. They're part of our human repertoire. And it might be of value to become more familiar with them. Certainly we know the extremes of bodily sensation, extremes of pleasure or displeasure, and how it feels in the body. But how about right now? And of course, as well, we could expand the field of our awareness to include the feeling of breathing. So you and I have been breathing all of our lives. It happens 24/7. We don't have to think about it. The body simply takes care of the process. And the invitation here is to simply become aware of what is already occurring, just as we became aware of sitting, which was already occurring. So nothing needs to be added. This body is actually breathing. And in fact, in a very real way, we're being breathed purely by the physics of having a respiratory system and sitting inside this medium we call air. And again, just as we didn't have to control how we sat, you don't have to control the breathing or improve it or make it better. The invitation is to simply feel it in the body, and some of us might feel it in the belly, others in the chest, or the more generalized whole body sense of the breath coming and going on the inhalation and on the exhalation. And of course, even as we're aware of sitting and how that feels in the body, and even as we're aware of the breath coming and going and how that shows up in the body, sound is also available to us. Sounds emerging from the body, if there are sounds, sounds from inside the room, the sound of my voice, the sound of the environment in which you find yourself. None of that needs to be blocked out. And nor is there any call to manipulate. The domain of sound. So for now, sitting here, feeling what is here to be felt in the body, hearing what is here to be felt and known, hearing what is here to be heard. And you might say in some way that we're learning to become more intimate with ourselves, with our experience. And part of that intimacy is the recognition that we actually have and the capacity for stability, for steadiness, of a kind of groundedness right here, right now. Might notice the mind wanders away, of course, even though you intend to be aware of the breath coming and going, or of sounds entering the ear and leaving, or of various sensations in the body coming and going. When you notice that the mind has wandered, first of all, simply recognize where it has wandered, and then gently and firmly returning to the awareness of the breath, if you care to. That gently means no need to be hard on yourself. No need to be aggressive or judgmental. And the firmly has to do with your commitment, a kind of resolve to bring the mind back to one of these objects of attention. And for now, let's say primarily the feeling of the breath in the body is useful for this stabilization. But almost any object will do. But for now, we're working with the breath, with the body, with the hearing. And then, of course, there's the whole realm of the mind of what we typically call thoughts and emotions. They have their own life, their own comings and goings, and they are really events that can be known in the field of awareness. Like, for instance, you probably noticed that thoughts have a beginning and a middle and an end, and emotions as well. They arrive, they have a life for some period of time, they perhaps move us in a particular way, and then they change and pass. And actually, we can learn to become attentive to these aspects of our experience that almost no one has ever taught us that we can actually observe closely, we can know. We mostly identify with them so strongly that we think that they're me, they're my thoughts, my emotions, and they're all true, or mostly true. But upon closer examination, often enough in an MBSR course, people discover they're not so true. And mostly they're limiting. And mostly they're the story about who I think I am or who somebody else thinks I am. And so we can learn to turn toward even emotions that we would describe as difficult or unpleasant, or thoughts we'd rather not have. In that wonderful poem by Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Sufi teacher and poet, he invites us in that poem, The Guest House, he says, treat each guest honorably. And he's not simply making reference to the nice ones, but, says the joy, depression, meanness. He invites us to welcome them for the simple reason that they're here. We don't have to like them, but they're here. And so this sense of welcoming means, what would it be like to actually meet them? To turn toward them rather than to conditionally and reactively turn away from them. And of course, you're the author of your life, so you make the decision when to turn towards, for how long, when to pull back. It's not up to me. He speaks about, the dark thought, the shame, or the malice, all of those emotions that we tend to want to deny, or that in some ways eat us alive. that we could actually pay attention to them. We can turn toward them and see them and observe them and recognize how they affect the body and what happens in the mind. How often they're the occasion for the arising of anxiety or rage or anger or sadness. Maybe even at moments, joy, elation. And so by turning towards, we're learning something about understanding something about the larger repertoire of being a human being. Because we're honoring our wholeness. We're honoring all that we are without trying to fix them, change them, manipulate them. But somehow by meeting them, recognizing them for what they are, realizing directly, by having lived into it, that we can hold, that awareness is capable of holding the whole show, everything. And through this, we're learning something about our hearts, about our capacity to actually be attuned to subtler and subtler dimensions of what it means to be a human being. And that offers us the possibility for liberation, for freedom. From the kind of narrowness of who or what we believed ourselves to be. And so, as we finish now, simply resting here for a moment. Awake, aware. If your eyes have been closed, allowing the eyes to open. Thank you. Certainly, and of course that's a common part of our human experience. Some of it is, of course, conditioned by the culture, because even when we're not sick, just think how much attention is given to the waistline. And in this culture, what it should look like, how it should be. And if it isn't like that, then the likelihood is that we're conditioned to disregard it or hate it or disconnect from it. And so it is with lots of parts of our experience, and often exacerbated when we are sick in some way or ill, and a lot of the landmarks of who and what I think I am begin to come apart, like my sense of integrity. In terms of, bodily existence, my sense of being a whole person, my sense of being able to do this or that, my desire to be the way I used to be, as a kind of ideal for what it means to be cured. Our sense of relationship with other people, our sense of relationship with ourselves is all challenged. All those ideas and views about who and what I am in relationship to myself, in relationship to other people, in relationship to the world are challenged and often threatened when we're not well, physically, mentally, emotionally. Or when we're, think about it in the language, when we're sick at heart. And, it's an interesting thing in the culture that the more, and I've been trying to study this, that, not in a formal study sense, but reading about it, understanding it, listening to it with the people that come to our courses, that even as the capacity, we have this great capacity to be connected through a whole range of devices, and we're being connected today this way, which is fantastic. That the level of isolation and loneliness in the United States is growing exponentially. The amount of depression is growing exponentially. So in some ways, this turning towards that I'm speaking about is a counter force to the deeply conditioned tendency to turn away, to disregard, to fragment. And that's why I called it an act of hospitality, because in some ways we're welcoming consciously, actively, deliberately the very things that we'd like to reject. And they start right here at home with ourselves. And so a lot of what begins to happen for people in an MBSR class is they're learning to turn toward, not in a way of resignation, but in a kind of deeper level of acceptance that I think is fueled by a kind of self-compassion and self-care that is part and parcel of our common humanity. Look, we all suffer. And in some very real way, our suffering is also the way that we can, over time, begin to understand the suffering of other human beings. And in that sense, it becomes an enormous resource. And so this act of turning towards is a kind of remembering, putting back together the wholeness that we actually are, and that gets undermined continually. Think about it in the culture. A marketing culture is always saying you're less than. And if you had this, or if you bought this, you might be complete. And that's an endless treadmill. And so you could say in a very real way in MBSR, people are coming back home. They're coming back to themselves. They're coming back to the discovery of their wholeness, not because I say so, but because they discovered within themselves as real, as adamant, as unimpeded radiance.